Housing is the biggest driver of inflation. Are interest rates the fuel? Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insights brought to you by Ainslie Bullion and the Gold and Silver Standard. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been looking at a number of things actually in the news today, issues she's been talking about in the past, but also digging in a little bit deeper, things like housing and inflation, but also immigration and other issues that are sort of all coming together. So very fascinated to have this conversation. How are you going today, Alex?
I'm going very well. How are you today, Chris?
Yeah, I'm good. Reading that news piece today, like I said, I've really been enjoying this conversation. Our audience has as well, because we've had some sort of comments and questions come through, sort of talking about this idea that it's quite interesting to see these underlying driving factors that haven't really been explained particularly well in other places. That we all know that we're experiencing inflation, but we don't necessarily know what's driving it. So I'm keen to dig back in a little bit deeper on some of these topics today, but can we maybe start off just by, you mentioned a term inelastic, and I think that's really important for the audience to understand, because you're sort of describing that the inelastic nature of some of these items is why we have the outcomes that we have. So can you maybe start off by explaining what you mean by this term inelastic?
Okay, so inelastic is an economic term where it can either happen for demand or supply. But what happens is, no matter what happens on the other side, so as demand increases dramatically, people need houses. There's no substitution. So they just bid up prices indefinitely. So you have these, a very tall cross on the demand and supply curve. And as demand is so big, they just bid prices up indefinitely. So with the high immigration that we've talked about and the low supply that's come through from COVID, what is going on is house prices, despite interest rates, despite costs going up, are rising dramatically. Only substitution anyone has come up with so far is to become someone's flatmate.
Well, we talked about that previously with Branko, and we got a lot of comments about him having to live on a balcony briefly, but yeah, it's really not a solution. And I take your point there. It is inelastic. We're not going to substitute that away because there isn't a substitute. So I really wanted to dig in, particularly, you talked about in the article this long-held belief in economics that higher immigration can solve a lot of the issues that we currently have with inflation. And my sort of take on that was that the idea is that if we have people coming in, that lowers inflation by driving down wages, because you obviously get people coming from overseas who are prepared to work for minimum wage. So drives down wages, makes everything more competitive is the theory. You clearly don't think that's the case based on the article today. Where do you see that argument falling down? Is there any sort of historical comparisons that actually support the idea that that works or doesn't work? What's your take on that?
So what's interesting about all of this is when you speak to people at the moment, people talk about housing costs being a huge inflation on everyone right now. Now, that's what's being spoken about, but everyone is arguing more immigration, it'll fix the wage growth. But they're not looking at the supply side issues that are coming through. So we've got housing, but, forget housing for a second. We were talking about, before you and I, just industrial properties. So I've got some experience in industrial properties, and, per metre rates in Wetherill Park at the moment have gone from about $130 to $220 in a year. There's a parcel of land in Epping that I know of that was $200 a metre 18 months ago. They're now selling for $800 a metre.
Yeah, massive increase.
Massive, but it's because you need warehouses for immigration. You need housing for immigration, and there's no substitution. So people are just bidding prices up in order to get their foot in the door, in order to supply people. So people know what's going on. And what was interesting was this article that I found by the Chicago Federal Reserve, which actually identified this in America. So they've gone region by region in America, and they've looked at the different inflation rates. So in Minnesota at the moment, the inflation is at 1.8%, whereas in Miami, it's at 9%. So Minnesota's at the point that the US Federal Reserve wants it to be, whereas Miami is holding the rest of the country to hostage. So looking at that, immigration in Florida is huge, and in Minnesota, it's negative. So just looking at one factor that could be causing this, is immigration and interest rate rises driving up inflation? Because the Chicago Federal Reserve concluded that it was housing costs that were the biggest driver in inflation, being rents and mortgage payments. So it's a very interesting conclusion that they've come to. And yet what you were talking about was this, like, if you look it up on news, just Google immigration and inflation, there is article after article by economists talking about wages and how immigration drives wages down. Now, in Australia, we've looked at this. It's definitely happening. It's definitely holding wages down. But they need to sit somewhere. Look at our house prices. Wages are holding or under inflation, but our interest rates are going up and our inflation's going up.
That's a really, a penny's just dropping for me there. That's really interesting, because you're effectively saying that it is working. Like, if we use Australia as the example there, it is working in keeping wages down, but that's actually an almost unintended consequence or problem that we have now, that we have wages not keeping up with inflation. So it's not like, the idea was we needed to keep the wages down so we don't end up in this wage price spiral. But if we're still having the price spiral bit, just not the wages part,
we've looked at the wrong thing. We've looked at wages, and we haven't looked at inelastic supply, which is the housing and the warehouses. So we haven't looked at the supply side. So we've only looked at labour. What was interesting as well is I was trying to find the article where it was originally brought up, and I know it was 2008. So back in 2008, there was inflation, as we know, pre-GFC. Inflation started to get out of hand. Interest rates started to go up. And so back then was when the article or the discussion really seemed to raise its head, I guess.
Yep.
And they spoke about creating immigration to drive wage growth down pre-GFC. Now, we also know that during the GFC, what happened was interest rates got driven up to drive down inflation, and there was a housing collapse. So they caused deflation, trying to control things, and immigration was one way they were doing it. And again, you had inelastic supply. You did not have houses available like they were before.
So yeah, that's really quite interesting, because you're saying there that that you could have contributed to the ultimate cause of the GFC by these policies in the lead up that were trying to address something else. So it's a consistent theme, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and I just think people aren't stupid. Generally, if there's a consensus and there's an understanding, it's not worth ignoring. People as a group generally come to the right conclusion. And if the conclusion that most people, you and I, speak to at the moment is that interest rates are driving inflation and that immigration is driving inflation, people are probably right. Now, immigration, just like during the GFC in 2009 and during the Rudd years when he drove up huge immigration, did eventually pull down to deflation. But it is a lagging indicator. It is not something that happens immediately.
Do you think that this all really comes back to an argument? Because how I'm starting to frame it in my head is that we try to use these long-term solutions to really a short-term problem, because you could argue that, I know we have had that high inflation rate, but it's certainly coming down. Like, all evidence seems to suggest that that has probably peaked, and the things that still say it's up, like housing, are the lagging components.
But you say that. Look at the data that we had today, not in high immigration areas. The inflation, in fact, Florida, and I'm not going to guess the facts, but I know April to May, the inflation went up, didn't go down.
Yeah. So you're saying sort of region specific examples. So it still seems to me, though, bigger picture, you shouldn't be trying to apply a solution that takes a long time. I suppose that's more what I'm getting at, that if you go, okay, the solution to this problem that we have right now is to implement something that takes years to unfold, like immigration. Would you agree with that?
I would totally agree with that. And again, the data in the article, I looked at the current immigration movements in the US across the 51 states and compared house price changes in year 1 and year 5. Year 5 is where, like, that has more causation by the look of the data to where we are now. So that's the long-term push, the long-term.
So immediately, like 12 months after, you couldn't really see the impact, but 5 years down the track, you definitely could.
You can definitely see the impact in both, but 5 seems to correlate more strongly in the rank of house price growth and immigration.
And that's kind of my wraps up my point there as well, because you go, well, should we really be making decisions around specifically something like inflation today that with a solution that takes 5 years to play out? That doesn't make sense.
And just like interest rates, they take a while to go through the economy, and we are just reacting by lumping one on top of the other on top of the other. And looking at inflation data, it started at energy. After the Ukraine war, energy prices peaked. That was a major cause of inflation. Well, right now, the major cause of inflation is housing, and the major contributor to housing cost is interest rate rises. So what are we doing?
It's a jumbled mess.
Everything's too fast. There's no, COVID was a short-term shock. Ukraine was a short-term shock, and we're applying economic theories that probably haven't been proven all that well, and they're long-term solutions. They're not what fix now.
Well, Alex, I really appreciate that extra depth there today. I think I'm starting to really get a framework in my mind that really is the issue. What you've ended on there, this idea of long-term solutions not necessarily matching the time frame. So it's a time frame problem. I think that's how I'm starting to think about it. So I appreciate that. That's really helpful. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. It's interesting because I didn't necessarily think this way, but the more people talk, the more you see reports like out of the Chicago Federal Reserve, you have to question that maybe this is breaking it more than fixing it.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be the theme, and we'll see that continue to unfold, no doubt. So thank you. Thanks for everyone for watching. Remember, reach out if you have those questions and comments. We do appreciate those, and we do read those. It helps frame how we go about this process. So thank you for those and people who contribute. That's us for today. We'll be back on Thursday with Sam to discuss all things markets and metals. Until then, have a great rest of the week, everyone. Talk to you later.